In 2010, 65% of the electorate voted, which is the third lowest turnout ever. Is this simply caused by apathy and people not being interested in politics, or symptomatic of a larger issue?
This is a pattern across all of the advanced, rich democracies, okay? If you look at the statistics across Europe, across the OECD countries, what you find is from approximately 1990, really, there's been a sharp drop in election turnout. The question that I want to answer in that is, why are they not turning out? And what we found in the studies is that in 2001, there was about 62% who didn't turn out for the first time, deliberately didn't turn out as a matter of deliberate political abstention. In the 2005 election, it was almost all of the non-voters. In other words, this is not about apathy. It's not about people who just couldn't be bothered because they're too content with their consumerism, with their booze and fags and daytime television, but because they are not represented by the system. Those are the facts.
It certainly is the electoral system which explains why abstentions in the United Kingdom are so much higher. And it's an electoral system which is incredibly undemocratic, because had there been a proportional voting system, Thatcher might not have been Prime Minister of Britain for all those years. I mean, she never actually won a majority of the vote in Britain as a whole. And Blair got less votes when he won as Prime Minister than Neil Kinnock did when he was defeated. So it's a very strange and weird system. That's one point. The other point is that in the last three, I think, general elections, the figures are quite interesting. A majority of the people between the ages of 18 and 26 didn't vote. A majority. And one reason for that is that they don't feel motivated by the three mainstream parties, really. I visited Scotland 3 or 4 times, more than that actually, during the referendum and after. And it was very noticeable that virtually the entire country was involved in the debate because the stakes were very high and people felt that if they voted, it would change something. So we just have to understand that when people are motivated, when they believe that some of their interests, but real political, social interests are at stake, they not only vote, they argue. And reducing the age in the Scottish referendum, though not in this election, to 16 meant that there were debates in all the schools in Scotland. I've never seen young people debating like this here for a very long time. So I think when people feel that change can come, they vote. And in England in particular, they haven't felt that for a very long time indeed.
Hi, yeah, I'd just like to pick up on Tarek's point that he mentioned briefly, that the majority of 18 to 26-year-olds don't vote. I'm just outside that age bracket now. But yeah, I think it is because of disengagement and the fact that we don't feel represented. Most of the parties that people are talking about, most of the issues and the things that parties are going on about are for basically rich white people. That's mostly, when you're a student, most of the people my age, the sort of class gap is getting wider, and most of us are down on our luck, you know? We're all struggling, fighting for survival, and most of the issues they're talking about, most of the people that they're trying to get votes for, are people who are just not in our situation. You know, they've been around because obviously you've got the sort of another 50 years of voting once you, after 25 kind of thing. And like you said, we don't get taught politics. I mean, I knew nothing about politics when I was 17, 18. When I was in school, you hardly hear about it at all. I think they started introducing politics A-level, possibly when I was in school. But yeah, it was a tiny minority. You really don't learn about these things. So when you get out of school, you've got no idea about really what they're offering, who's good person to vote for, what are their stance on health, immigration, education, why should you vote for these people? We've really got no idea. I mean, that's my stance and view, and I think that's why we don't vote. And lots of people I know are very, very staunch against voting. Lots of people I know my age really don't want to vote because they think that just nothing's going to change.
You had the student movement. People were very trying. This is not really. Yeah. So people were trying to save EMA. Students were protesting because they didn't want their tuition fees tripled. They got swept up in Clegmania. They decided Lib Dems were the way forward. Lib Dems got in office, and what did they do? They tripled tuition fees. EMA was scrapped. And so I feel like it's not just, sometimes even if you do vote for the party you think has your interests at heart, you're not necessarily going to get what you want, which is why I would more support people to go with grassroots campaigning and try to organize on a level. Since then, we've had quite a few student occupations happening where people are demanding free education, which is a beautiful thing to see. This has to be a long-term campaign, but it's nice that people are actually looking at this political system that didn't work for them, but instead of giving up, have decided that instead they're going to take matters into their own hands, they're going to get around, they're going to organize and try to change the system.
Just to pick up the point about free education and doing politics and getting out on the streets, and I've spoken at Occupy, I've spoken at a whole range of things. But what I would like to stress is this isn't an either-or. The Green Party, we do all those things, but we also do electoral politics. And all of those things can achieve things, can make an impact, can really empower people. But ultimately, a lot of the decisions are still being made in your council, in Westminster, in Brussels. And that's why I'd say do both. But I think that important message that goes back to the schools is to get across to the idea of people that politics should be something that every single person does in some way or another. And that can be really small scale, click a petition, sign a petition a week or something, tweet something political. But ultimately the idea should be politics should be something that you do, because otherwise it's just something that just keeps being done to you. And changing the idea of politics being an active thing, not a passive thing, is really critically important.
My question is the following. I think we're kind of coming to a conclusion, well, maybe not yet, that we should do both. We should vote and we should also get involved. We should vote and we should also get involved in grassroots politics. What I want to know is, if we're doing both, what should we expect from either one of them? So what should we look to politicians to do? And speaking directly to you, Natalie, because I would really like the Green Party to win. And even if they do, though, I recognize their hands are going to be tied on certain things. There's going to be limits to what they can do. So I want to know from you is what should we be doing on a grassroots level? What kind of change should we be looking for? And what should we be expecting from politicians? And what are the limits to that? And I would like you to speak honestly about it, if possible.
That's a really interesting and really big question. To start with, perhaps what should you do is the grassroots politic should do and demand whatever it wants within reason. And I was thinking about Occupy and the way in which they fenced off the Occupy democracy, the recent protests outside Parliament, and they fenced off Parliament Square because they had to protect the grass. Now, I think in those circumstances it's perfectly reasonable to say we demand our public space and we're going to take it. And, demanding that right to public space, and I think picking up something that Richard said, demanding control. So, the privatisation has been one of the horrendous trends which has just kept racing and racing on. But one of them areas of privatisation has been the privatisation of the coercive power of the state. That means the privatisation of policing, probation services, the privatisation of the whole way of our legal system works. And I'd say, one of the things that we haven't seen a lot of, and I'd really urge everyone in this room to campaign against, is to really say this is not acceptable and we're going to fight that. So, I'd ask the street campaigners to really identify what really matters here and what's really taking away your freedom and assert the right to take it back. What you've got to do is identify 3 or 4 really important things and change those as the government, as the starting point, and only take on the next 3 things when you've achieved those 3 things, because you can just get yourself in such a muddle trying to change everything. And the other key challenge is to keep your eye on those key 3 prizes. Keeping your focus on that and not getting derailed, I think, is what you should be asking of future governments, hopefully future governments that are your kind of governments, not the current kind of governments.
Well, I'm not sure how transferable is the example of Podemos to any country. I mean, of course, there are lessons, or not lessons as such, but there are things that we can look at and analyze. Of course, Spain, in 2011, it was suffering all the consequences of austerity measures in a way that this country hasn't suffered, of course. And so these unprecedented grassroots movements, and people were taking the street in a way that never is happened in the country. So similar to what you were saying in 2009 and all this, climate camp and Copenhagen and everyone really being very excited. But then we had the general elections and the conservative right-wing party won with majority. And this has very serious consequences. So straight away they started changing policies that they have consequences to citizen liberties, and at the moment it is almost illegal to protest. So you have so there is this issue about grassroots movements and what you were saying, which is they're very important, but if we don't have the necessary representation in politics, then all this can be illegalized directly. So we can completely push down all the power of grassroots movements. So I think for the experience of Spain, what happened to us is that we realized that the way politics is done has to be completely changed. It cannot be left on the hands of a few technocrats and a few specialized, professionalized people, but we need to take responsibility and take the politics back to the people and participate in politics, all of us. So this is what Podemos is trying. Of course, it's really difficult and we are struggling very much. It's just a 1-year-old party and it's a very difficult task, but I do believe that the way we have to understand politics has to radically change. We cannot continue to delegate the responsibility of our countries, of our economy, of our institutions into this elite of technocrats and professional politicians that are so removed from the reality of citizenship.
So I want to ask, what is the efficacy of voting in that case? Why should people vote when they feel like the party they want to vote for is never going to gain enough power to achieve meaningful change?
I think you can't totally, I think tactical voting used to be more popular than it is now. And one reason it isn't that popular and people aren't attracted to it, though some will still do it, is because the difference between the 3 political parties where most of the tactical voting takes place, to keep the Tories out. Well, let's just question this for a minute. Keeping the Tories out, fine. It sounds good, it is good. But what you replace the Tories with carries on with Tory policies non-stop. So then what the hell is the use of tactical voting? Vote for people you agree with, not just for people you're opposed to. Otherwise, we're constantly stuck in this rut.
All right, so this is just a big mess, okay, with voting, obviously. So we've got, if it's not judicial coups, as this dude's just pointed out, if it's not the complete inability for a political party to actually do anything, as you pointed out, okay? If the tactical voting, so that there's just a whole bunch of things in the air that just skews this whole paradigm that we're supposed to be involved in, right? So my question is, what happens if less than 30% vote? What happens then?
I'm kind of struck by the futility of voting, and I do feel a responsibility, like to the heritage of social struggle. So I want to, I'm thinking about spoiling my ballot, but then I feel like that's totally, looked down upon, and I wonder what the scope is for a bigger campaign towards a no-vote campaign again. I know that happened in the past. It wasn't very successful, but maybe something creative and artistic where people spoil their ballot with saying something like poetry or art, and then taking a picture of that spoiled ballot, and then you can create something from that, which might be a bigger statement than going along and making an X. In my constituency, it's a safe Labour seat, so I could just vote Green, but what's the point, really?
I quite identify with the dichotomy you face and the point that the gentleman there sort of quite eloquently pointed out. Either it's, and I went through this struggle. I've never voted prior in any election, and I've been eligible for 2 prior to this. I've registered to vote because I feel a sense of duty, because I can't bear the thought of another, coalition government or a Tory-led government in power. So I've registered to vote. I don't believe in the system, but I feel like I have to do something. In my mind, it's either complete disengagement, where it's less than 30% and no one shows up, or less, like a negligible amount of the population shows up, or it's heightened consciousness where everyone shows up, like you saw in Scotland. So I've registered to vote, and I'm going to vote. But I don't know whether I should actually vote for a party or just simply state this system does not represent me, spoil the ballot, in those words, and just leave it at that.
Well, the question of should you just not vote whatsoever, or try and get what would happen if less than a third of people voted. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if less than a third of people voted, David Cameron would still attempt to implement austerity measures and so on, because the likelihood is that 30% would be right-wingers who were doing it, you know what I mean? And this is the thing, is that the electoral system does not represent us, but it exists and it shapes our lives. And I suppose you think on the 8th of May, although I think it'll probably take longer than this, when a government is formed after the election, if that is a government of David Cameron, Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg, will we feel confident to fight back? The likelihood is we'll feel absolutely awful. If it's a government with Miliband and Sturgeon and, I don't know, an anti-austerity alliance of the Nationalists and the Greens, would we feel more confident? Probably. I mean, we know Labour are absolutely awful, but people, well, it's true, isn't it? But people wouldn't feel absolutely demoralised. And this is the point, that May the 7th is not the point of politics today, it's about afterwards. And I think we have to fight for people to feel confident that whatever government is in power, we take on austerity, we take on racism, we take on war. And that's why I think the question of tactical voting, we shouldn't just rule it out. If you live in Thanet South, I would be voting for Labour, because if you don't, Nigel Farage will get in. These things do matter. Let's fight to make things, not just on the 7th of May, afterwards as well.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I agree with the guy in the...
Stand up,
I agree with the guy in the green hoodie that I think that there is a place for tactical voting, and I just wanted to ask Tariq Ali, you said that it's important to vote on positive policies. It's important to vote on positive policies rather than going for a tactical position. And I live in the same constituency, it sounds like, as you, where the Lib Dems and Labour are neck and neck. So I don't want to throw my vote away, but on the other hand, I was going to ask you, do you think that tactical voting has a place, and also especially in the era of current coalitions where we could hope, and you were saying, for instance, voting for Labour, it'd just be like voting for Tories, but actually if we consider the coalition factor, voting for Lib Dems and voting for Labour, it's if we consider the coalition element, do you not think voting for Labour to be in coalition with a party left of field is something to bear in mind, and worthwhile to bear in mind to take on that tactical position? Sorry, did you...
Well, look, I was very interested, some years ago, when soon after the Tories came in and upped the tuition fees, and there was a wave of university occupations by students, and the chants that went round London universities and occupied buildings was Tories come, which was fine. But I did ask myself, and I did ask the students at these occupations, actually, the people who introduced tuition fees in higher education were Labour. And when they introduced them, did any of you or your predecessors think about occupying the universities and shouting, Labour scum, Labour scum? Because they were the ones who did it, after all. Half of them didn't even know that it had been done. And in fact, it was Ken Livingstone who told me, he said it's really embarrassing they were introducing these fees. Not only is it an appalling measure, but I'm stopped in the corridors of the House of Commons by John Major, who says that when I was Prime Minister, every term, every 3 months, some idiot from the Treasury would say, let's charge tuition fees for university students, this is how much we will raise. And he said it was a piffling bloody sum. And as someone who'd never been educated myself, because my father didn't have the money to send me, I said, no, we are not charging students tuition fees, and I'd throw the thing in the wastebasket. And the minute Major says to Ken Livingstone, Blair and Brown are in office, and the same civil servants go to Brown, they say, what a good idea. Yeah, we'll make a bit of money. So the reason I say this is there is a history to all this. Every single time people imagine that Labour will be better. And on one or two things they might well be. But in general, especially since the Blairites took the Labour Party and destroyed social democracy within it, it's been the same business all over again. They will not even commit to challenge austerity. We would do it differently. We will give you nicer austerity. But you know, you tell that to the kids, young people without jobs, especially in the north of England, but not exclusively, who travel miles and miles on buses to reach big warehouses by 7 o'clock in the morning, and someone comes and picks out 50 or 60 of them for that day's work. This happens, by the way, in England, and it happens in India, and it happens in Mexico. So this is what is going on, and are we challenging that or not? You know, that's the point I'm making. So don't have too many illusions about the extreme centre parties, they back austerity, they attack their own people, they believe in surveillance, they defend spying, and they go and make wars. What the hell do we want them for?
I think a few people put a question to you, but I would also would love it if you kind of got back to the original question as well, because obviously as the Green Party leader, you are encouraging people to vote Green, but it doesn't work. The Greens are not going to win, so people are wondering, why am I wasting my vote? Why am I doing this?
And picking up the point about tactical voting and, you know, what impact the vote for the Greens will have. It was actually a ITV reporter who asked me this a day or two back, and it really struck me that if you look at, they were saying, you know, why haven't the Greens swept England before them like the SNP have swept Scotland before them? And it is a bit of a bigger country, which makes life a bit more difficult to start off with. But also, there's the point that the Scots really started with the referendum. And in fact, they started a couple of years before the referendum with the radical independence campaign that was much more than the SNP and much broader and much deeper and much more the public meetings. So, you know, we've seen our membership quadruple in about the past 6 months virtually. Most of the rise has happened. You know, every Green vote is going to give us a chance to keep surging after the election. Every Green vote is going to make whatever MPs we manage to elect, beating the first past the post system, much more powerful. So, and the alternative of voting for Labour, we've got the politics we have now. We have the Labour Party we have now because people have been tactically voting for decades. Labour has been able to ignore its base, assume its base will keep voting for it, and just target the swing voters and the swing seats because people have tactically voted. And if we're going to get a different kind of politics, it is actually in voters' hands, your hands, to start to deliver a different kind of politics on Thursday. It's a start. I'm not saying it's going to be everything, but it's a start. And if we don't start now, when are we going to start?
Fundamentally, the state is not an actual democratic institution. If you think about large parts of the state, they're completely unelected. You know, the top civil servants, the military, the police. And if you think of your boss who decides whether you're going to be hired or fired, where the resources are put, none of these people are elected. So my sort of question basically is, can we actually change things through the state? Because we've talked a lot about Syriza, South American governments who've run up against limits. You know, they can do certain things, but then they run up against the limits of the state. So my question to the panel is, can we actually change things fundamentally?
Should we vote? No, I don't think that we should vote. I think by voting we're upholding a system that's inherently undemocratic. I think that regardless of who gets into power, they're going to do things that we don't actually want. I think all the major powers are beholden to corporations. They're going to support things like austerity, which no one wants. They're going to support things like fracking, which no one wants. I do think we'd be better off focusing on community organizing and really kind of skilling ourselves up and fighting for whatever is going to come for us. And so, yeah, I just don't really think it's worth my time.
Okay, so I completely agree with the opinion that holds that we have a system that doesn't work. So first of all, the electoral system is completely unfair. In Britain, it's the first past system that simply doesn't work. It's unrepresentative. So that's a big issue to deal with. We have some reforms that we need to take on. So I agree with the opinion that holds that we have a two-party system that is neoliberal, that has imposed austerity on the people, and there has been a great deal of suffering that's come from that, and voting won't change that. However, there's also a rise in we have to look at the elections in the context of a rise of the right wing throughout Europe, and a vote could go to counter that right wing. You know, we need to think about tactical voting in the context of the broken electoral system we have. But I think our votes can change something sometimes at the local level. So I think we shouldn't, and this dilemma between voting and legitimizing an electoral system versus grassroots activism, I don't think that should be that dilemma. I think we should be working on both. We should be working on both battles and wars. So I'm for voting.
I think so, yeah. It's a right that's been won for us. I don't expect an awful lot out of it. It's kind of the feeling that I think is coming out of this debate that we're having about should this country vote, is that it's an opportunity to make a stand, it's an opportunity to make a point. And yeah, politics isn't about a vote every 5 years.
Well, for me personally, I am going to vote, and I'm going to vote Green, because I think a lot of people have faith in the electoral system, or they understand elections as being a way in which you can deliver change in society. So I think if there is a high progressive vote, it gives a lot of people confidence in that change is possible, even if it doesn't deliver particularly this time. But having said that, I'm very critical of the electoral system, and I don't think that change is fundamentally comes about through elections. I think we have to build movements from below, or build social movements from below, and for me that means being involved in grassroots struggles. In London you have kind of communities taking quite radical action, fighting back to claim their right to housing. There is a kind of emerging housing movement, and for me that's a kind of really important struggle, a key point of struggle in the kind of wider system. And you can build an argument about systemic crisis, that the system is in crisis, I think, from building a housing movement. And so for me, that's what the most important thing in terms of what we need to be doing in the next year or so. But I would never tell anybody not to vote. I'm going to vote too.
Well, what does your conscience tell you? Does this system work? Those are questions which you should be asking before you even decide it. At the end of the day, you vote. That's the only democratic process which takes place for the next 5 years. Nothing else which takes place after that is democratic.